I'm happy to introduce our first speaker for today. Marco Ranaldi is an assistant professor in economics at the College London and director of the UCL Centre for New Economic Transitions. So thank you so much, Marco, for joining us, and feel free to share your screen.
So first and foremost, thanks so much, Paulis, for the introduction, and thanks for actually having me here during this month. I'm extremely excited of being here, and on a personal note, I'm excited to be back in Paris after 6 years since I left, considering that I did my PhD at the Paris School of Economics in 2019. Differently from the title suggested at the very beginning, I decided to call this talk Capitalism in Transition, and I think this is going to be mostly what I will try to write and work over the next month here at the EAS. And the structure of this talk is basically going to be divided into two parts. The first part is somehow setting the scene of what I've been doing so far in my research agenda, which is basically an economic research agenda. And at the very end, I will sketch some questions and path that I hope I will be able to work on over the next month. To begin with, let me start with some key concepts since this is an interdisciplinary audience, so I thought it's important to set the vocabulary scene. And in particular, I'm going to refer and speak about capital in this presentation as an asset, which can be either financial or real. So we can think of stocks and bonds for the financial side or housing from the real side. I will refer to labor as work, which is sold in exchange for wages. And then I will refer to capitalism as a system in which most of its production is driven by private ownership. This is characterized by decentralized coordination as opposed to state-owned coordination, say planned production. And then it's characterized by what we can call as the profit motive. So this tendency coming from individuals and firms to increase profit and generate new capital. And a key feature of capitalist systems is the division of income into two factors of production, which are precisely capital and labor. And this is the way I'm trying to put together these three working concepts. So capital, labor, and capitalism. We can think, for example, of GDP, so gross domestic product, which is the standard measure of produce of an economy, as being composed into profits on the one hand and compensations of employees on the other. So now, why am I doing this? Because what I think is going to be really important to discuss is that the distribution of capital and labor incomes, which are stream of income that people earn out of owning some stock, so some assets, so from capital, but also from their work. So the way these two income sources are distributed can give us important information about what they call as distributional varieties of capitalism. So what do I mean by distributional varieties of capitalism? One way to think about them is to consider two extreme societies. So one we can call as classical capitalism. And this is what we usually refer to when we think about the capitalism of 100 years ago, which was mainly characterized by a division between the very rich capitalists, so rich people earning from capital, and the poor people earning from laborers. As opposed to this system, we can now think of a new type of capitalism in which actually rich and poor people are increasingly more simultaneously being capitalists and workers. We have examples everywhere around us of people that at the same time earn income out of their work, but also out of owning assets, even, for example, being homeowner. And now, how do we study the world under these two different extreme economic systems? And what I've been doing over the past years is to develop this new inequality concept that I call compositional inequality, as well as a measurement framework, so an analytical mathematical framework to measure compositional inequality, precisely to assess the extent to which economies are distributed between these two extremes. To give you an illustrative sense of what I mean by compositional inequality, so let's consider an economy composed by two individuals, a rich person and a poor person. And in this economy, of course, we can tell that there is some degree of income differences, a degree of income inequality. There's a person who's richer than the other. However, what we don't know out of this picture is the type of income that these two individuals are earning. And we can imagine three different economic systems. System number one is an economy in which actually the rich person earn only income from capital and the poor person earn only income from labor. And this is what we define as classical capitalism. However, we can think of an opposite economic system, which is less likely in today's world, which is the one in which the rich earn from labor and the poor earn from capital. And then we have a third system in which both rich and poor earn jointly income from capital and labor. In the first system, we have a classical capitalism as in the past, in which the composition of income is very different from rich and poor. That's why we have compositional inequality. In the last system, we have that both rich and poor earn both sources of income, and so we have no compositional inequality. The composition of income is the same between rich and poor. And with that said, the level of income inequality in these two societies is basically the same. So I'm simply introducing a new inequality lens to look beyond the unidimensional nature of income inequality and look at the types of income these individuals earn. Why do we care about compositional inequality? I argue we care for at least two reasons. One, compositional inequality allows us to link capital accumulation on the one hand and income inequality. Why is this the case? Well, the intuition is simple. If the rich earn all the capital income in the economy, and if the economy transition into becoming increasingly more capital abundant, for example, through the existence of new techniques, new machines that replace labor, then this will automatically increase income inequality. The reason why this link it's important to be addressed is because maybe you're familiar with the Thomas Piketty enormous work and book Capital in the 21st Century, in which he documented important tendencies happening in major, especially in the developed world, on the dynamics of capital accumulation on the one hand and income inequality on the other. And he was assuming this link to be positive. But no one has properly studied this link in a precise manner, as well as from a political economy perspective, which was the purpose of my work so far. And the second reason why I think this is relevant is precisely because from a political economy perspective, compositional inequality allows us to get a sense of this distributional variety of capitalism. High compositional inequality implies classical capitalism, in other words, rich capitalists versus poor workers. And this somehow is a way to map economies with the existence of kind of social classes intended from an economic perspective. Low compositional inequality is a system which is new, in which rich or poor are both capitalism workers, quote unquote. Now, the question is, do countries around the world follow classical or new capitalism? This was the output of a work that I've done in tandem with Branko Milanovic, who is a leading scholar on global inequalities. And what we do here is simply we put together in a simple way compositional inequality horizontal axis. So high levels imply classical capitalism, low level new capitalism, and income inequality, vertical axis. High level imply high income inequality and low level imply low income inequality. And what we observe is first three major clustering of countries. Latin American countries seem to be classical capitalism with extreme level of income inequality. European countries seem to have mild level of both dimensions. And finally, we have the cluster of Scandinavian countries that combines a low level of income inequality, but also high level of compositional inequality, so a form of classical capitalism. And we discussed the nature of this cluster. But I think the most important result from this picture is the absence of countries in this region of the diagram. So we do not see, at least from this sample, which cover the 80% of global GDP, we don't see countries that combine low level of compositional inequality, so an economy in which both rich and poor have at the same time capital and labor, an extreme level of income inequality like in Latin American countries. And a second result that I think it's important to mention is coming from a recent paper of mine, in which what I do, I study the global distributions of capital and labor income. This is basically about imagining the world as a single nation and trying to study how capital income and labor income distribute across people around the world. And what we can learn from this result is that On the vertical axis, we have the growth rate, so the extent to which different types of income have grown at the beginning of the 21st century, so between 2000 and 2016. And what we observe is that there's been an important increase in capital income at the individual level, happening in particular at the middle of the global distribution. And this is basically China. In other words, we see that the world as a whole at the beginning of the 21st century has seen an important increase of quote-unquote capitalization of the global middle class, which goes in the direction of equalizing the composition of income between people around the world. So if we were to stylize these main findings, we could basically say that first, there are three clusters that emerge. Latin American countries combine high extreme income inequality, but also high compositional inequality. Western countries combine relatively low levels of both dimensions. And then we have the Nordic cluster with extremely low level of income inequality and high compositional inequality. As for the Nordic cluster, the reason why this happens is because the Nordic system combines important bargaining processes happening at the wage level. So wages are bargained, unions are strong, and so these compresses the distribution of wages. But on the other side, the wealth accumulates a lot. And in fact, it's through wealth accumulation that we see this important divide between rich capitalists and poor workers. The second part of these results is there has been an important capitalization of incomes at the level of the global middle class. And this is particularly driven by China. And this is in line with the important results from global inequality literature. And finally, that there seem to be no country that display low compositional inequality alongside with high income inequality. So the next question is compositional equality desirable? And I provide three set of arguments in favor of compositional equality. One, it's empirical, and it's precisely that we do not seem to see countries in which rich and poor are at the same time capitalists and workers with extreme level of income inequality. The second is a set of macroeconomic argument. In other words, if everyone has a little bit of capital, and if we see an increase in the capital in the economy. For example, we see, again, new machines replacing labor. But if these machines, quote unquote, are distributed between everyone, then this would not affect income inequality overall. And the second reason is that if we see short-term labor market shocks, so people start losing their jobs in the short term, having some differentiation of income can help them navigate this period. And finally, from a fairness perspective, compositional equality implies also lower wealth inequality, which is the most concentrated source of economic power we can think of. However, just like one final note on the relationship between compositional inequality and redistribution is that, of course, the way we think of redistributing the composition of income matters. And in fact, this can be reduced in four ways. First, we can think of deconcentrating capital income at the top, which can be done, for example, through taxation. Then we can think of reducing compositional inequality by increasing labor at the top. But this is, of course, for example, this happens when we see the increase in the income of CEOs of companies. This implies increasing labor income of the very rich. But this, of course, reduces compositional inequality, but perhaps this is not what we aim at doing from a policy perspective. We can think of decreased labor income at the bottom. This would also decrease compositional inequality, or increase capital income at the bottom. And point four is the one I'm more interested in. So how do we think of an economy in which we start capitalizing also the bottom of the distribution? And of course, as I was saying, if we have a social welfare objective, these different options have varying degrees of desirability. Suppose we want to maintain the level of income inequality, then option 3 and option 2 and 3, would not be desirable because at the same time we would increase income inequality in the society. To conclude this presentation, let me focus on this residency. So given what I've presented so far, the purpose of this residency is to study compositional equality in relation to 4 major societal transitions. And these 4 transitions are also related to the UCL Centre that I'm directing that focuses on economic transitions, which are first, we can say distributional transition. So we witness an increase in the concentration of economic power, the rise of top income share, the rise of wealth inequality. The question is, can compositional equality mitigate economic inequality? And of course, as I was claiming, if the economy is becoming increasingly more composed by machines and by capital, and the GDP of the economy increasingly more composed by capital, then it's good to have a more equal composition of capital and labor to absorb its impact on income inequality. The second point, it's about the environmental transition. And the question is, how does compositional equality relate to environmental inequality? One angle is that when we think of environmental inequality, we think, for example, of the distribution of CO2 emissions among people. And these emissions are not only driven by consumption, are also driven by investment decisions. And so investment decisions are related to wealth, and therefore the connection between capital and CO2 emissions is straightforward. Third point, it's, as I mentioned already, the technological transition. And one question that I aim at addressing is, suppose that we have a fair asset distribution, would this make employees more open to, say, AI-driven change, as well as reduce work hours without cutting salaries? Well, that's an important question considering the major implications that the AI-driven technological transition is actually having on the economies globally. And finally, the political transition. The question is, suppose we are in a state of compositional inequality, then how would this shape political preferences towards right and left wing parties? Because in this case, we would have that people just thinking about the role of taxation. If people earn both multiple sources of income, then a party, say a right-wing party, claiming to somehow reduce taxation of wealth, this would be beneficial for everyone in the distribution, but also you would like to have protections from a labor perspective, which is coming more from the left. So what are the implications of compositional equality for political preferences? And a final point, and then I conclude this presentation, is that I aim to understand how social policies around the world are both directly and indirectly already shaping the global capital and labor income. And I'm thinking an example is the social wealth fund. Social wealth fund are interesting instrument existing, for example, in countries like Norway, which is about public wealth, state managed, and which is growing in the market. And then it's basically giving people a pension. So that's an interesting concept because it's about wealth, but it's public, state owned, and it's about giving money also to the middle of the distribution. So yeah, so this is basically the objective of this residency. And with that, I stop it here. And I thank you for the time and for the patience so far.
Thank you. So, are there any questions from the audience?
I have a question. I don't know. Do we raise
Yes.
hands in these or
Yeah,
just
no,
go
go
for it?
ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. That was fascinating. And my question is about how you think about or how people in your field think about different kinds of capital, just because, given that housing is such a big share of the increase in the distribution of normal people having capital, but it's not the same thing. It's not as productive or more illiquid than a lot of other kinds of capital. So I don't know how that comes into play in this work.
Thank you so much. Pai, what do we do? Should I collect a few questions or address each one?
We have some minutes. You can answer, yeah, one by one for now.
Perfect. But Pablo, thank you so much for your questions. That's a very good point. And in fact, one of the things that I will be doing during this residency is to take some step back and think more generally about concepts that we have to define on the basis of what we know from a measurement perspective, like data availability, and think more the way I would like to define capitalism and capital given what we have. And you're right. I mean, I think of just like the main sources of the definition of capital are housing for sure. Then you have financial wealth. And then, of course, you have pensions. And these three components are already very important and they affect different segments of the distribution. So the way you deal with them have, of course, different distributional implications. So that's one first point. Another important point is that there's another source of income, which is that of self-employment income, which is, for example, the most problematic source of income in relation to the distinction between capital and labor. Because self-employed people are people that to work, they of course need to put input like doctors, course, but they also need to have an office. They also need to have equipment. And this equipment is about asset and capital. And so what's the component of their income coming from work input relative to having assets? And the distinction between this, like the literature split 70-30, or the thing a little bit more elaborated, but that's in a context in which AI is rising. And we can imagine that AI is a stock of asset, like license, patents, that is entering in the way we work. Well, we can start thinking that maybe our work becomes increasingly more like self-employed, because we also have some asset producing with us. And then how do we conceptualize this in this framework? So yeah, just to give a sense of the different sources. But thanks for your point.
Sorry, I was on mute. Wonderful. I think David is next.
Yeah, I have thank you, Marco, for this simulating presentation. I have a question which is quite in line with that of Paavo, maybe a little bit more radical. So I think that you give us assumed something that for people who are not involved in the field is quite counterintuitive. So which is just the idea that we are facing an increase in compositional equality. What do you mean? Can you explain more concretely? What do you mean when you say that in present time there is an increasing equality in the participation of capital? What do you mean when you say that poor people have increasing assets of capital? And which capital? I mean, Paavo made the example of housing, but how much, let's say, poor people detain a part of the capital which is involved in the productive process, which also means in which extent lower, well, let's say poor people participate in the process of economical decision, because I mean it seems to me very counterintuitive what you are saying. And also a very short remark, I wouldn't give so I mean, yeah, I in an historical perspective I wouldn't give so much as given the fact that in classical capitalism there was, I mean, classical capitalism also lived along with a very strong part of the economy, which was not a monetary economy. So I think that also on the other side, you have to nuance a little bit the assumption that classical capitalism, I mean, not classical capitalism, but society in classical capitalism was characterized by this, was completely characterized by this unequal distribution of capital. I don't know if I have been clear enough above all in the second part. Anyway, yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, David. These are super good point. And so as for the first point, why do I claim that we are tending towards a more compositionally equal economy? So first, it's by taking a very long-term perspective. If you look at, for example, the trends of the composition of income at the very top of the distribution, 1930 US and today, but this is just one stylus fact I can show. You can see that back at the time, top 10% was basically all about having capital income. Today, top 10% is not only about having capital income, but it's also having labor income. Now, if we focus on the top 10%, those who have capital income are, for example, also CEOs. Sorry, not only, but also labor CEOs whose income is labor. But of course, it's questioned the extent to which this type of labor, but it's labor. The question is whether the bonuses that they attach to their salary are actually the fruit of extra work, or rather a form of rent, which is basically Stiglitz's argument. So the point is, if you take a very long-term perspective, it's inevitable to think that the middle classes is becoming increasingly more own owner. If you look at the trends in China, you see the spectacular rise of home ownership rate and the increase in capital income from private property, which is unprecedented. And whatever happens in China has huge global repercussion. Even other studies like Daniel Waldmanstrom has written recently this book, somehow bringing a different narrative from Piketty's one, which was let's focus on the very top, which he did, and it was absolutely important to be done. Also, given the methodologies he was following, it was just like focusing on the top 10% because it was easy to calculate using historical data. And this indicator was very fine to be used in a comparative perspective along the very long run. But in many Western economies, you see the increasing wealth in the middle of the distribution. And this is mostly housing. That's definitely mostly housing. But also, if you think about the increase in financial literacy around the world, this is also the reflect to the fact that finance is becoming increasingly more inclusive. So, I mean, once again, if you take a very long-term perspective, I think you can start claiming this. But of course, I mean, we don't have trends over the last 10 to 20 years which go all in the direction of decreased compositional inequality.
Yep. Yeah, but owning a factory is not the same thing as owning a stock action.
True. I'm getting there. No, you're totally right. So this is, of course, an individual perspective. So a household perspective on capitalization that I'm taking, for sure. There's actually now in economics this literature which is about saying, let's try to relate the macro with the micro dimension by taking GDP and distributing GDP across people in the best way possible. So we're trying to go in the direction of attributing the role of a firm ownership and just like being part of the process of a firm as mapped into the income that you earn. Now, clear example of that is the increase in share ownership of many companies. So when companies are increasing the board of just like increasing share ownership, of course, this doesn't imply that also the employees have such a great say, but this is something which is relatively new as compared to the past. And that's kind of a sense, that's kind of going in that direction. Again, I agree that it's kind of the beginning of a big process, but I think it's a direction that in part we're witnessing. And I totally agree with you about the difficulty in comparing just like the very distant past classical capitalism with today's one, given somehow also the role of non-formal economies, if we want. I know less about it, but it's a very good point to just like be a bit more cautious about that. But thank you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. I think Chiara next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Marco. I have two sets of remarks, one about machines and the other one about peoples. You mentioned a few times technological developments and machines in general, and the way in which you talk about machines sounds to me like you're implying that machines are owned by people. What if at a certain point machines are not, let's say, passive anymore, and they somehow ask us for a kind of recognition if they on their own agency? That's not so science fictional as one can think. So do you address this problem in somehow? The other set about people, I was wondering how poor people and child can be included in your work, because I was thinking about child labor. So children do not, I mean, they do not possess anything. They are not wealthy in any possible way. So how do they fit or not fit, don't fit in your framework? And when I think about poor people, I don't necessarily think about the poorest, but there are many degrees of poverty today, and even people who actually own something or even have a job can be considered poor. So how your compositional equality exclude poverty? Because I think that you can have compositional equality among poor people.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting set of questions. To start with machine, so the first short answer is that I am not dealing with this scenario in which machines are leading to controlling actually the economic system and managing sort of people as forms of labor. But I totally agree with you in the sense that I see that this tendency is absolutely possible. And the way I think in terms of very, very long-term development of nations, I really think that the reason why we need to start thinking how to make sure that so translated in economic terms, what you're saying, if it's true that the machines become increasingly more capable of replacing labor in any segments of the labor market along the entire income distribution, not only replacing now the high skills through high skill related tasks, but also the bottom of the distribution, then it means that GDP is going to become increasingly more composed by profit coming from these machines. Suppose that we end up in a scenario in which GDP is 100% composed by profit. This is another way of saying we don't need labor to function, we only need machine. And to a certain extent, this is a scenario in which machine rule the economic system. To get ready for that scenario, be it more or less likely to happen in 10 years, 100 years, but at some point I agree it will happen, then we need to smoothly transition towards that vision of the economy. And the only way for me is to start imagining that these machines are, in terms of the income that they generate, are somehow start to be distributed more equally across the population up to a point in which then everyone get a fair amount of return out of the machine's work. So, I mean, it's very long-term perspective discussion, but the economic counterpart of his argument, I think it's precisely about thinking a GDP which is entirely composed by profit produced by machines. And the way to transition there is through redistribution of profit then. Now, this first point. The second point, it's a very good. So when, of course, you do this type of analysis, you focus mostly on income coming from the market, and income coming from the market may exclude segments of the population. You may, for example, decide to exclude pensioners because you don't know how to classify pension as an income coming from capital and labor. So first, it's of course contingent to what's going on in the market. First point, you may exclude people. But at the same time, the way you account for the presence of, say, demographics in the way you measure income can be done in multiple ways, can be done in economics through, for example, I have an income of the family and I want to give a small amount to each members of the family. And this is the way you somehow create the scales within the families. But as for the type of labor which is basically not captured by statistics, which is basically what you refer to, this is something that is absolutely missing, and that should simply be acknowledged in economic studies. So a few reactions to your points.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
Great, thank you. I think Lucia is next, right?
Yes. Thank you, Marco, for your presentation. I was wondering, how do you consider the international financial system, which integrates countries in a subordinated position, in the definition of these three clusters that you mentioned? Or, I mean, how the contribution of geopolitical and and financial relationships in the configuration of what we are calling the compositional inequality.
Yeah, thank you, Lucia. It's a very difficult question because, of course, when I look, even when I focus, for example, on this graph, which is about the world as a single nation, of course, you need to make sure that people around the world are comparable. And the way this is done is basically to adopt some technique that convert $1, basically the meaning, the value of $1 in one country to be precisely comparable to what you can do with $1 in many other countries. So the first step towards that is to make sure that these people are comparable at a global scale. And then it really depends on the approach that you take. From this graph, the approach is to imagine that the world is like a single nation. And so you take what is called the cosmopolitan perspective on income distribution. But of course, the problem of this approach is precisely that, differently from this graph, in which you have each single country have like a distribution of resources by its own, you can intervene. In this graph, you can intervene politically to change and shape the distribution of resources. When you switch to a global cosmopolitan approach, you don't have a global governance. So you cannot properly intervene in a way which is like as you can do within each country. So the point is, first, the relevance of studying global inequality studies, given the fact that you cannot influence this distribution without global governance. But this is just like, of course, only one part of the answer, because then to be able to account for just like the general global imbalances, this is something which is beyond what I'm doing. So I have less to say, but that's a super good point.
Therefore,
Thank you.
does David had another question, or is that the same one? Because I see. Oh, okay. Wonderful. I don't see anyone else, and we're approaching the end of this first talk. So yes, remember, you will all be here this month, so feel free to continue these discussions and to the yes.